The real question becomes something much quieter and more unsettling. What exactly were you attached to in the first place? Because once you look closely, you realize the attachment was never just external. Most people think attachment is about holding on to someone, something, or a situation. But that's not where the real grip is. The real attachment is internal. It's the identity that formed around that connection. You don't miss the dynamic itself. You miss who you were allowed to be inside it. That's why letting go can feel like self-erasure. You weren't just participating in a role. You were recognized through it. It gave you a position, a tone, a set of expectations that told you how to move through the world without questioning yourself. And when that disappears, it's not just the relationship or situation that ends. It's the mirror that kept reflecting a familiar version of you. Carl Jung described this when he said, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is." In practical terms, this means we learn to survive by becoming readable. We shape ourselves into something that fits the environment, something predictable, something that keeps friction low. And over time, that shape starts to feel like you. So when you detach from the environment that required that shape, the mind panics, not because it wants the situation back, but because it no longer knows how to perform itself. You notice it in small moments. You hesitate before speaking, unsure which version of you is allowed now. You feel awkward in silence that used to feel natural. You realize that certain reactions you relied on don't make sense anymore. That's identity attachment at work. You weren't clinging to the situation. You were clinging to the stability of being someone specific. Jung warned that this kind of attachment is subtle and dangerous when he said, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another." There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. Yet we keep trying to live by the same internal script, even when the context has changed. Because letting go doesn't just mean losing validation. It means losing orientation. Without the old role, there's no immediate feedback loop, no instant confirmation of who you are. And the absence of that feedback can feel like emptiness, like you've stepped out of focus. This is the part that no one prepares you for. You expect grief, you expect sadness, but you don't expect the identity confusion, the strange sense that you've become less defined, and the mind hates that. So it reaches backward. It romanticizes the past. It exaggerates what you lost. It convinces you that going back would restore clarity. But what it's really craving is not the situation. It's the certainty of self. Jung addressed this illusion directly when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." In other words, until you see how much of your identity was built in reaction to external structures, you'll keep mistaking identity loss for emotional loss. Letting go strips away borrowed definitions. It removes the labels you wore without noticing. It exposes the space where your identity was being propped up rather than chosen. And that exposure is uncomfortable, not because something is wrong, but because something artificial has been removed. You're not disappearing. You're becoming unmasked. And that moment, when the mask falls but the new shape hasn't formed yet, is where most people panic, retreat, or rebuild the same identity somewhere else. Because sitting with identity attachment requires something rare: the willingness to exist without immediately knowing who you're supposed to be. And that's the part no one talks about, because that's where real separation begins. Not from the past, but from the version of yourself that needed it to feel whole. So when the role dissolves, when the mirror that once reflected a familiar version of you goes quiet, something else steps in immediately. Not clarity, not calm, control. Because when identity loosens, the ego doesn't wait for understanding. It reacts. The ego's job is simple. Maintain continuity. It wants you to feel like the same person today as you were yesterday. Predictable, recognizable, contained. So, when letting go disrupts that continuity, the ego interprets it as a threat, not a metaphorical one, a real one. Because without a stable identity, the ego loses its reference points. That's why the reaction feels urgent. Suddenly, your mind starts asking questions that sound practical, but are actually defensive. What did I do wrong? Was this a mistake? Should I go back? These aren't neutral thoughts. They're attempts to restore the old structure as quickly as possible. Carl Jung captured this dynamic when he said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." But the ego resists that choice, because choosing requires uncertainty. Ever notice how people say, "just let it go," like it's some light, casual thing? Like you're dropping a set of keys, not a piece of yourself. Because the moment you actually try to let go, something strange happens. You don't feel free. You don't feel relieved. You feel disoriented. It's that quiet panic where you think, wait, if I'm not holding on to this anymore, who am I right now? And nobody warns you about that part. They don't tell you that letting go doesn't feel like release at first. It feels like erasing a familiar version of yourself. The routines that kept you steady, the reactions people expected from you, the role you knew how to play without thinking. And when that disappears, even temporarily, your mind rushes to fill the gap with fear. Because what you're losing isn't just a situation or a connection. It's the identity that formed around it. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And that's exactly what letting go forces you to do, before you feel ready. So if you've ever tried to move on and felt like you were unraveling instead of healing, if letting go made you feel smaller, emptier, or unrecognizable, stay with me. Because that reaction isn't a setback, it's a signal. And what it's pointing to might change how you understand yourself entirely. So if letting go doesn't feel like freedom yet, if it feels more like standing in a room with the lights off, trying to recognize yourself by memory alone, that's not a flaw in the process. That feeling is the clue. Because the real reason letting go hurts has almost nothing to do with what you're releasing, and everything to do with what it quietly took with it. Letting go hurts because it doesn't just remove something from your life. It removes structure. And most people don't realize how much of their identity is built out of invisible structures they never chose consciously. Think about it. You don't wake up every day asking, "Who am I supposed to be today?" You already know, because the situation, the relationship, the role, or the routine answers that question for you. It tells you how to speak, what to tolerate, what to expect from yourself, where your value comes from. So, when you let go, you're not just losing a connection. You're losing the internal script that kept your behavior consistent. That's why the pain feels deeper than logic can explain. You weren't attached to the thing itself. You were attached to the version of yourself that existed inside it. Carl Jung put it this way: people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. In everyday terms, That means we'll cling to familiar discomfort if it gives us a clear identity. Because uncertainty doesn't just scare us, it dissolves the map we were using to navigate ourselves. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Many of the roles you let go of weren't chosen because they made you happy. They were chosen because they made you coherent. Maybe you were the dependable one, the calm one, the one who didn't need much, the one who held things together while quietly bending yourself out of shape. Those roles gave you consistency. They gave you predictability. They gave you a sense of who you were in the world. So when you release the situation that required that role, the role doesn't fade gently. It collapses. And the mind interprets that collapse as danger, not because you're actually losing yourself, but because your identity was partially outsourced. Outsourced to expectations, to patterns, to repetition. So now there's this gap, a moment where the old version of you no longer fits, but the new one hasn't formed yet. And that gap feels like loss. It feels like disorientation, like standing still while everything that once defined you keeps moving forward without you. Jung warned about this exact moment when he said, "No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." What he's pointing to is this: growth requires the collapse of old structures before new ones can stabilize. But most people panic at this stage. They assume the discomfort means they made a mistake. They think the pain is proof they let go of something essential. When in reality, what hurts isn't the absence of the old. It's the absence of definition. You're not losing yourself. You're between selves. And that in-between state is the most psychologically uncomfortable place you can be, because it removes certainty before it offers replacement. That's why letting go doesn't feel like relief at first. It feels like standing without a script, a role, or a reference point, waiting for yourself to reintroduce who you are, this time without leaning on what once defined you. So when that structure disappears, when the routine, the role, or the unspoken rules are gone, the question isn't why does this hurt anymore? And uncertainty is the one thing the ego cannot tolerate for long. So it panics. It replays memories selectively, highlighting the moments where the old identity felt powerful or safe. It minimizes the discomfort that led you to let go in the first place. It turns familiarity into evidence. This is why the past suddenly feels clearer, kinder, more stable, right after you leave it. The ego isn't seeking truth. It's seeking relief. You can see this in everyday behavior. You improve your boundaries and feel more anxious than before. You stop over-explaining and feel rude, even when you're being fair. You slow down your availability and feel guilty, even when nothing bad has happened. That guilt isn't moral. It's structural. It comes from breaking an identity contract the ego was invested in maintaining. Jung warned about this internal backlash when he said, "The greater the tension, the greater the potential." But most people don't see potential in tension. They see danger. So the ego tries to collapse the tension by rushing you into a new version of the old self. Same behaviors, same reactions, new context. Anything to avoid sitting in the undefined space. Because that space exposes something the ego wants hidden, that your sense of self was never as solid as it felt. And that realization is deeply unsettling. So the ego reframes the discomfort as loss. It tells you you're broken, that you've lost your edge, that you're less than you were before. But that narrative isn't accurate. It's defensive. The ego would rather convince you that you've diminished than allow you to reassemble yourself differently. Jung spoke directly to this fear when he said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Stripped of metaphor, this means growth requires facing the parts of yourself that relied on external structure for validation. The panic you feel isn't weakness. It's the ego reacting to a power shift. Because for the first time, identity is no longer being maintained automatically. And the ego knows this means one thing: it's no longer in full control. That's why this phase feels chaotic, why your thoughts feel louder, why everything seems urgent. The ego is scrambling to reassert familiarity before a deeper reorganization takes place. And here's the part most people miss. If you don't understand this panic response, you'll mistake it for truth. You'll assume the discomfort means you made the wrong choice. You'll go back, not because it's right, but because it restores a sense of self quickly. But if you stay, if you resist the urge to fix, replace, or retreat, something shifts. The ego loosens its grip, and in that loosening, space opens. Not for chaos, but for a self that isn't built entirely on what you needed to survive yesterday. So after the panic fades, after the ego runs out of old scripts to replay, there's a quieter phase that feels even more unsettling. Not fear, not urgency, nothing. And that nothing is usually where people turn back. Emptiness shows up first because removal happens faster than replacement. When you let go, something stops occupying space in your inner world. A role, a pattern, a constant source of reaction. But nothing rushes in to fill it. So what you feel isn't peace, it's absence. And absence feels wrong to a mind that's been trained to measure itself through constant input. We're used to defining ourselves by what we respond to, who needs us, what expects us, what pulls at our attention. So when those demands disappear, the mind doesn't interpret it as freedom. It interprets it as loss of signal. That's why emptiness feels heavy instead of light. Carl Jung pointed to this stage when he said, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." In this phase, the mind hasn't settled into new sense yet, so everything feels vague, dull, or pointless. And that discomfort triggers a familiar thought. Something is missing. But what's missing isn't meaning. What's missing is direction. You're no longer being pulled by external structure, and your internal one hasn't reorganized yet. So you feel unmotivated, flat, uninspired. Not because you've lost drive, but because drive used to come from pressure, and pressure is gone. This is where people get confused. They assume emptiness means they've lost passion, that they've become disconnected or indifferent. But what's actually happening is a withdrawal from stimulation. Your nervous system is recalibrating. It's adjusting to a quieter internal environment, one without constant cues telling you who to be next. Jung addressed this necessary pause when he said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In plain terms, you can't skip the empty space. You can't replace what was removed until you sit long enough to feel its absence without immediately numbing it. That's why this stage feels unproductive. There's no visible progress, no emotional payoff, no clear reward, just space. And space can feel threatening when you've never learned how to inhabit it. So the mind starts bargaining. It looks for distractions. It invents urgency. It convinces you to fill the silence with anything familiar. Not because it's helpful, but because emptiness exposes how much of your identity depended on constant engagement. This is the moment most people break. They mistake the quiet for stagnation. They mistake neutrality for failure. And they rush to reattach to anything that restores emotional movement. But if you stay here, if you resist the urge to fill the gap immediately, you notice something subtle. The emptiness isn't hollow, it's neutral. It's a holding space. A pause between identities where nothing is demanded of you yet. And that's deeply uncomfortable for a mind used to proving itself. But it's also the only phase where a new internal structure can form without being rushed or distorted. Because emptiness isn't the end of self. It's the clearing, the moment where old definitions stop echoing, and new ones haven't started speaking yet. And if you don't run from it, that silence becomes information. Not about what you've lost, but about what no longer controls you. So when the emptiness lingers, when nothing rushes in to replace what you released, the discomfort starts to feel intolerable. And that's usually when the biggest mistake happens. At this stage, most people don't consciously decide to go backward. They tell themselves they're moving forward. But what they're actually doing is rebuilding the old identity in a new location. Same patterns, same reactions, different setting. Because emptiness creates pressure, and the mind wants resolution, not accuracy. So it reaches for what it knows. It grabs familiar behaviors and rebrands them as growth. It restores old roles under new labels. It finds environments that reward the same version of the self that just collapsed. Not because that version was healthy, but because it was defined. Carl Jung warned about this subtle trap when he said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." Translated into everyday terms, this means we will recreate discomfort if it spares us from identity uncertainty. This is why people often repeat the same emotional patterns even after letting go. You step away from a draining dynamic, then immediately overcommit somewhere else. You stop explaining yourself constantly, then find a new place where you feel compelled to do it again. You swear you're choosing differently, yet the emotional weight feels strangely familiar. Because the behavior changed, but the identity didn't. The mistake isn't returning to the past. It's carrying the past inside you while convincing yourself it's new, and the ego loves this move. It gets relief without transformation, continuity without disruption, familiarity disguised as progress. But this shortcut has a cost. Because the emptiness you rushed to escape doesn't disappear. It gets postponed, and it comes back later, heavier and harder to ignore. So if letting go feels like losing yourself, now you know why. You didn't lose your core. You lost a structure that once told you who to be. And that's unsettling, because structure feels like identity when you've lived inside it long enough. But what you're experiencing isn't failure, weakness, or a regression. It's the aftermath of definition falling away. Carl Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." And that choice doesn't appear fully formed. It emerges slowly, after the panic, after the emptiness, after the urge to rebuild something familiar just to feel grounded again. Most people never stay long enough to reach that point. They rush to replace themselves. They grab the nearest version of certainty and call it healing. But if you've made it this far, if you've sat with the discomfort instead of running from it, then something important has already shifted. You're no longer defined by what you needed to survive before. You're no longer borrowing identity from roles, reactions, or expectations. You're standing in a space where nothing is demanding you perform. And that's rare. Because from here, identity stops being automatic. It becomes intentional. Not loud, not rushed, not performative. Chosen. So no, letting go doesn't mean losing yourself. It means meeting yourself without the script. And the question isn't whether you'll recognize who you are next. It's whether you'll resist the temptation to become familiar again, or stay long enough to become honest.